The purpose of this video is to learn about different types of laws. So at the end of this video, you should be able to contrast public law and private or civil law, explain why criminal law is part of public law, and also contrast domestic and international law. This video links to the syllabus point circled at the bottom of this slide, namely outlining the types of laws. So this diagram is designed to help you understand the relationships between these types of law, focusing on those shaded in yellow. If we think about the classification of law in Australia, we can divide it into two broad types, being public law and private or civil law. Criminal law is included within public law. So before we consider the differences in the types of law, I just wanted to stop and consider these two scenarios. So in the first scenario, you suspect your neighbour has murdered someone and you're wondering whose responsibility it is to take them to court. In the second scenario, you have a dispute with your neighbour over a fence. They agreed to pay for half of it and now they've changed their mind. And again, you're wondering who will take them to court. So pause the video and just take a moment to think about these two scenarios. So these two scenarios highlight an important difference. In the first scenario, a crime has been committed and we would expect the government to prosecute this individual on behalf of society. It wouldn't be reasonable to expect a private individual or organisation to take this person to court for murdering someone. Okay, so in the second scenario, this is a dispute of an essentially private nature. It doesn't really concern society at large or the standards of behaviour that society expects. So in this case, you would take your neighbour to court and hire a lawyer to represent you. Your objective wouldn't be so much to have your neighbour thrown in jail, rather you would be seeking sort of compensation or money for the wrong that's been done to you. So they should pay for the fence, or at least half of it. So the first scenario would be covered by what we call public law, and the second would be a civil law issue. So going back to our diagram, we can add the following definitions. So public law is the body of law governing relationships between individuals and the state, or the nation, or the government. Whereas private or civil law is the body of law governing relationships between individuals, meaning individual people or organisations, or companies. Now we're going to move down to the next level. So administrative and constitutional law are beyond the scope of this course, but in essence they deal with the structure and operation of the government. And before we talk about criminal law, we can briefly talk about a number of different types of civil law. Contract law is about the recognition and enforcement of contracts, which are essentially promises between two or more individuals. So if I make a contract with you and then break my promise, in effect breaching the contract, you might use contract law to sue me for damages of money. Tort cases deal with torts or civil wrongs. So unlike in contract law, there is no legal relationship between the individuals prior to the wrong occurring. There are different types of torts arising from different activities, including, but not limited to, negligence, trespassing, and defamation. And then finally, property law is a wide area of law that governs relations involving things and interests that can be owned and that have a commercial value. So, for example, we can think about the rights you have in relation to your personal property or real estate coming under this type of law. So let's contrast criminal law as an example of public law against private or civil law. And that's what this table here is doing. So in the first row, we're talking about what do these types of law deal with. Criminal law deals with crimes, which are essentially attacks against the standards of society and obviously the victim as well. Whereas private or civil law deals with wrongs of a private nature between individuals. In criminal law, it's the state or the government, the nation, who brings the case on behalf of society, enforcing those standards. Whereas in private law, it's an individual who brings the case, an individual being a person or an organisation. Then in the courtroom, it involves a prosecutor and a defendant. The prosecutor in criminal law is the state or a representative of the state, whereas in private or civil law it involves a plaintiff and a defendant. The plaintiff is the individual who brought the case in private or civil law. So the aim of criminal law is to punish the offender and achieve justice and protect society, whereas in private or civil law, the aim is more to compensate or restore the party who suffered damage, compensating with money. So in a criminal law case, the standard of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's a higher standard than civil law cases, which require balance of probabilities. And it makes sense because in a criminal law case, the consequences can be very severe. So you're going to need a very high level of evidence to actually convict someone. And then you have some examples there that I won't go through for each of those different types of law. So let's look at some examples just to flesh this out, whether these are criminal or civil law. So in this case, we have a grape grower. His vines and property have been damaged because some chemicals blew over from his neighbour's property. And it tells us that he was awarded $7 million for damages to sort of fix the damage. So this definitely sounds more like a civil case where the wrong is being compensated rather than a criminal case where the government is prosecuting. In this second example, we have a defamation case. So again, Rebel Wilson here seeking compensation for damage to her reputation after an article was published in Women's Day and the Australian Women's Weekly. So again, this would be a civil case where she's seeking compensation for the damage rather than, the government prosecuting Women's Day or the Australian Women's Weekly journalists on behalf of society. And finally, we have an executive for Coca-Cola in Australia. He was found to be committing fraud and stealing from the company. Now, it says that he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. So straight away, we should be thinking this probably sounds more like a criminal case, and fraud is actually a criminal offence. So this would have been criminal law as a part of public law. So we're going to switch focus now and change gears. We've been talking about public and private law and criminal law as types of law within Australia. Now I want to stop and just think, what is the difference between domestic and international law? Where does international law come from? Maybe pause the video for a moment just to see if you have any existing knowledge on this. So domestic law refers to the laws of a country, such as Australia, for its own people. So we're talking about a single country and the laws within that country. Whereas international law governs the relationships between countries. International law enables countries to participate in trade and commerce and provides mechanisms for the maintenance of peace and security and the reduction of conflict. It also covers fundamental human rights, for example, making it illegal to torture political prisoners or commit genocide. So one of the main criticisms of international law is that it lacks the power to enforce that law. So this is an important difference between international law and domestic law, where in domestic law you have countries that are independent and they have the authority to rule themselves, they have sovereignty, and so they can make and enforce domestic law. Whereas in international law, you're trying to manage states or countries which are powerful entities in themselves, and really you're relying on those countries consenting to cooperate in the enforcement of international law. So it isn't so much that the international community can enforce international laws on countries, it's more that countries agree to these international laws. And on that note, when we're talking about the main sources of international law, treaties, which are effectively international agreements between two or more countries, are the most common source of international law. They can also be called conventions or covenants. And I don't want to get into detail with the sources of international law because it can become very complex, but suffice to say that these treaties need to be what they call ratified to actually become binding on individual countries. Other sources include customs, which are sort of traditions, and then legal decisions and legal writings. So speaking of treaties and agreements, Australia ratified the Paris Agreement in November 2016. So this is an example of an international agreement, and under this agreement Australia agreed to commit to reduce its emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030. So it's worth considering how this international law could actually have an impact on business. This is commerce after all, and I wanted to make the point that international law can certainly impact business, and the impact of this particular agreement could be profound for the Australian economy. So I hope this video has helped you understand the difference between public, private or civil law, criminal law, domestic and international law. Have a go at answering those success criteria then to test your understanding, and revisit any parts of the video if you feel you need to.